well, just by very quick way of introduction, because there's a friend in the room. I had the privilege of going to a women's college myself many years ago, along with a lovely friend here. So the Smith connection is a strong one, but I think that's probably what awakened my interest in the idea of lots of women living together in a Edwardian building, which is what that situation was. So, and then I did a bit of work on this many years ago at the Architectural Association when I was doing the building conservation diploma there, and then put it aside for a long time and have come back to it more recently. And some of the treasures that the census has brought to light, and indeed a number of the archives, some of these slightly granular pictures you'll see tonight are from those. But there's all sorts of amazing discoveries that have been found and yet to be found. So this is where I've got so far. So in her guidebook, published in 1900, the journalist Dora Jones declared, "The life of a bachelor girl in a big city is a wonderful and glorious vision. What a thing it must be to be like Celia in London, who has a career in music perhaps, or art or journalism, who lives in chambers like a man and has a latchkey and goes in and out unquestioned and knows by sight at least so many interesting men and women." The thrill of this kind of independent life was no doubt a draw to London and other cities for some young women, while for others it was the necessity of earning a living in the new roles at the turn of the century. Hostel House and Chambers is the story of the distinctive new building types that house the intrepid new working woman at this time of extraordinary change. It's the history of a remarkable genre of residences, the ladies' chambers, the working women's hostels, that developed to provide a home for a new wave of single working women in Victorian, Edwardian, and interwar cities. These buildings were an architectural phenomenon of their time, and one that assisted one of the most dramatic social movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, women entering the paid workforce and the independence that enabled. This is a dining room scene in Brabazon House, which we'll come back to later in Pimlico. In England, this is very much a London story, as the capital was where the new kinds of jobs, and thus the need for housing, was the greatest. It was also where the building type developed with such sophistication and specificity, thanks to the feedback from women residents, the thoughtfulness of the women patrons, and the skill of the architects who specialised in this sphere. The floor plan of the women's hostel, and some of you eagle-eyed architects will be able to spot there's a blurry one in the top right-hand corner. It efficiently evolved to suit a wide range of incomes and to accommodate women in different roles and walks of life. It was also quite often a story of unassumingly converting existing townhouses that then slipped quietly back into original or other uses outside of this period. But my focus is on the new purpose-built building type. And this is Brabazon House again, a lovely drawing, and you can see some of our women just arriving there, hopefully on the left. The advancement of women workers outside women as workers outside the home marked a dramatic social and economic shift of the late 19th and 20th centuries. By 1900, a quarter of British women were engaged in the workforce. Many were single and young, ready to leave the family home and assert their emerging independence, while uncommitted to a husband, children, and traditional domesticity. Between 1861 and 1911, the number of women clerical workers increased from 279 to 124,000. And women working as teachers, nurses, shop assistants, and clerks in England and Wales leapt fourfold from just under 200,000 in 1861 to 800,000 in 1911. Alongside greater access to education and 19th century inventions of the sewing machine, the telegraph, the telephone, the typewriter, meant that women stenographers, typists, secretaries, bookkeepers, accountants, and cashiers were working in a new proliferation of offices with new machines. I love this image. It's in Lincoln's Inn, a building that's still there, and these women are clearly learning shorthand or practicing it on that easel. But obviously the great focus of the photograph is that magnificent typewriter. This burgeoning community of working women had a considerable presence in Edwardian London, which created a major spatial and moral challenge. This wonderful quote, taken from real life, I'm sure. Women increasingly took on a confident presence in the metropolis, a presence that was much remarked upon at the time. And I quote, "In London, the headquarters of women who typewrite are in and around Chancery Lane. There, throngs of girls are to be seen each morning hurrying to the offices of the typewriting firms where they are employed." But another new technology, the bicycle, also transformed mobility and the urban landscape for women. In 1892, Lilias Campbell Davidson established the first cycling organisation solely for women, and in 1896, Clementina Black declared that the bicycle is doing more for the independence of women than anything expressly designed to that end, other than perhaps the typewriter. With this burgeoning population of single working women, the concern immediately turned to where should they live. It was clearly a matter of great concern, and many groups were involved with their own solutions and campaigns, with enterprising schemes of the mid-19th century that paved the way for independent female living. The earliest project that you see here for poorer women was this imaginative conversion of a London townhouse by the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes to accommodate 57 women. You can see there's a before and after pairing, which illustrated an ingenious conversion of a ubiquitous London family townhouse on the left into model lodgings that would accommodate a startling 57 single women. You can see there's just on this one floor sample, first floor, 20 cubicles, with the only structural change being at the rear, that completion of the L there. The wall thicknesses show us the thin partitions were being worked into cubicles. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I might have a pointer. Anyway, you can see, I'm sure. The cubicles here. Oh, and that's the dotted line of a bed. And pity these poor residents are not even hardly big enough for the bed itself. And communal lavatories there on the landing. There was no explanation to accompany this plan, but it revealed a need for housing women on a large scale, which presaged the movement of half a century later. The work of housing women and girls in urban areas was initially taken up by the stalwart 19th century Christian organisations like the Church Army, the YWCA, and the Girls' Friendly Society, all initially focused on working class women. Particularly prominent was the Homes for Working Girls in London, established in 1878 by John Shrimpton and aimed more at young women working in factories and workshops. The modestly dressed women you see here, engaged in improving activities under a biblical message, showed the public what good a shared Christian lodging could do. Now, all of these housing options were quite small, and the class and religious associations meant they weren't suitable for everyone. They were certainly not sufficient in number. In fact, in 1883, a pamphlet of the Homes for Working Girls estimated that 800,000 women in England supported themselves through paid work, and about 320,000 of these were in London. The vast number of single working women needed respectable, affordable places to live. The movement to accommodate them was established by the large ladies' residential chambers in the 1880s and 1890s, like this one, which is Sloane Gardens House. It's still there, it's the Sloane Club. Women campaigned in their journals of the time for what they called a castle in the air. It was described in Work and Leisure in 1888 as, quote, a happy and safe dwelling for some 100 or more ladies who are proud to know and style themselves working bees in the great busy hive of London. This ideal dwelling house was to have a range of room options, from cubicles to apartments, a restaurant, common rooms, and various services, because the need for, quote, wholesome and cheap lodging is so greatly felt by unprotected women of all ranks. These developments for newly professional gentlewomen, as they were called, were encouraged by new limited dividend companies whose business-like approach to developing lodgings attracted women investors and residents alike. Although these schemes had a sound social principle, they were emphatically not charities. Any perception of charity would have dismissed the spirit of independence that women associated with their new building type, and it was this savvy financial rigour that appealed to late Victorian and Edwardian women who took pride in gaining their financial and domestic independence. These are amazing photographs taken by Bedford Lemire and commissioned by the architect just before it opened. Here's another one of Sloane Gardens House. It illustrates that these Victorian ladies' chambers were, in this case, very architecturally impressive. Red brick terracotta building designed by John T. Lee, and the first project of the Ladies Associated Dwellings Company. This one opened on Chelsea's Lower Sloane Street for 55 women in 1888, and then quickly expanded to triple that occupancy by 1890. Suiting its well-heeled neighbourhood, Sloane Gardens House had a lively roofline. You can see these finialed gables and tall, dramatic chimneys, and these lovely oriel windows sort of marking the corner, in a sort of idiosyncratic Jacobean style. This monumental 6-storey building also included a lift and fireproof construction, which meant that every floor of it could house bedrooms and cubicles for the single lady residents. While there were some cubicles on the upper floors, most of the 150 women lived in single bed-sitting rooms, a creative arrangement making two spaces out of one, where an alcove bed, like you can see in the back of the image, was screened off by a curtain, making a snug sleeping space when entertaining guests in this tiny multi-purpose room. At the opening, Princess Mary Adelaide, quote, inspected their very tastefully furnished rooms. Perhaps she saw room B14, which we see here with its a la mode interior. There's a paisley print quilt, a sort of striped garment kind of slung over that rather chic kind of Japanese screen. We can see there's a fireplace with display space for precious trinkets and photographs from home. And it was all condensed into this bed-sitting room that was all hers for around 8 shillings a week. The resident of B14 is unknown to us, but she likely shared a profession with the first generation of the house's residents: artists and photographers, government clerks, a civil service typists, secretaries, journalists, a political speaker, an organizer, a chemist, and a librarian. They were amongst her companions in 1891. Now, a serial in the Girl's Own newspaper, published in 1898, was set in a fictitious St. Edward's Chambers for Women. It might have been this one, or it might have been one we'll see in Marylebone later. Remarkably like this building, described as looming large as a red brick pile, even in the wide and many-mansioned street of which it formed a part. The protagonists of this story, her aunt, described the rooms that her niece lived in as having posters of Japanese or Pre-Raphaelite paintings, rush-bottomed chairs, beds with an elaboration of cushions and hangings, and a hammock chair or two that invite to cigarettes and midday snatches of unrefreshing sleep, a consequence of work or excitement, pursued mainly by lamplight. She later in this story goes on to describe her niece's rooms. She was shocked by, quote, the comfortless muddle of her rooms, with burnt ashes in the fire grate, unwashed breakfast dishes, and, quote, dust over everything. She said, I think many of them are striving to live true to their ideals in a way that might put our quieter, easier lives almost to shame. Her old friends and neighbours used to tumble in and out of her room, sit about on the floor in the most uncomfortable attitudes, laugh and make fun incessantly, saying the cleverest and most daring things. I think she was partly horrified and partly intrigued, wishing she was living in such a place, I expect. As a crucial counterpoint to these tiny bed-sitting rooms, the serviced building also provided the residents with genteel communal rooms, including a library and several sitting rooms. Music was clearly important to the residents at this time, and there was a 4th floor studios for hire and music rooms for practicing, although this justified a stern reminder that pianos will not be allowed in the rest of the building. Heaven knows where they would have fit them. The residents took their meals in this large dining room, photographed just before the opening with white tablecloths, potted plants, silver salt cellars, all under that lovely lantern with arched trusses, electric lights, and a stenciled frieze. The company's second project was the York Street Chambers, designed by Eustace Balfour and Thackeray Turner in 1892. As with the others, this was not at first glance dissimilar to the other mansion blocks in the area. This is in Marylebone, although an unusual stone plaque, which I'm afraid is actually just off the image on the return elevation, announced it as exclusively being for ladies. This is a very rare sort of mention of this in any sort of architectural way. Like the others, it was Queen Anne in style, definitely considered a satisfactory style for these large-scale residential buildings, particularly ones for women, since the gables, sash windows, and red brick suggested a comforting domestic environment. And here's the plan of this York Street Chambers. The 50 residents had a choice of flats, bedrooms with separate sitting rooms, a pairing there and a pairing there, sharing this joint pantry, or bed sitting rooms like we'd seen at Sloane Gardens House. The basement on the left had both private and large dining rooms, as well as servants' rooms, providing housing for another less visible class of working women. These layouts suited an emerging class of professional women with a genteel balance of private accommodation that allowed for respectability in the flats, as well as communal spaces that fostered networking, support, and camaraderie, mainly in the basement in these dining rooms. Indeed, the first women members of the RIBA, Sisters Ethel and Bessie Charles, ran their architectural practice from this building, and Lynn Walker was the first person to tell me about that. I'm grateful to her. And Florence Dugdale was another person who lived here, a teacher and writer of children's stories who worked for Thomas Hardy, going on to marry him in 1914. And she penned her own, quote, charming books and magazine articles for children from her own room in this chambers. There was also a doctor who applied especially to hang her shingle outside and be able to work from this accommodation. So just a tiny little aside into clubs, because the provisions for reading, writing and other activities that we'll see in these buildings were definitely there, but it was acknowledged that women needed another place they could go for diversion and a change of scene. Juliet Appleton, the protagonist of a novel called The Typewriter Girl in 1897, shared her tip about the National Gallery when she said, on 3 days in the week, the British nation throws those stately rooms open, free, to any woman who chooses to enter them. I use them as my drawing room. You get a comfortable chair to sit upon for nothing, you get pictures to look at, and in winter the gallery is heated by flues over which you can stand and warm your feet gratis. Women's clubs were developed to augment women's existence in the London hostels and chambers, as well as to cater for those who lived further out and came into London periodically. The first was the Somerville Club, 1878, followed by the Alexandra Club, the University Women's Club, and the Pioneer Club and the Lyceum, each with slightly different characters, but for similar reasons of providing respite and stimulation for independent-minded professional women in London. And that's the Pioneer Club. So I'm just going to turn briefly to London's municipal story, which is a whole big saga in itself, really, but worth touching on briefly tonight. The campaigners who were really behind these women's lodgings and residences really hoped that London County Council would fulfil its duty to house working women. But despite many attempts from 1897 to build a municipal women's lodging house, it was not ultimately successful. The LCC investigated the need for such lodgings and prepared architectural plans like this set here, but due to the requirement for the schemes to be self-sufficient and through the Secretary of State's repeated disapproval, the plans were never realised. The LCC considered several sites, such as this proposal from 1905 on Parker Street near Covent Garden. This was the architectural partnership of Davis and Emanuel. They devised these plans for a 4-storey women's common lodging house with accommodation for 50 women in a series of cubicles. We'll see more of those later. There was no common sitting room here, but a kitchen and a small day room in the basement. However, it was deemed impossible to build a house of the necessary size and type that would be financially self-supporting. Men's projects, which we'll see in a moment, had the same government requirement of self-sufficiency, but their much greater scale and higher men's wages meant that this test was easier to meet. In 1910, the LCC's medical officer revealed that the real need, to his surprise, was amongst educated, low-waged earning women, not women of, quote, irregular and often immoral life, as he called them, or factory girls. However, factory workers were too poor to afford and sustain a municipal lodging house. And conversely, poor middle-class women did not fit into the LCC's aims of housing the destitute. And subsequently, the LCC's efforts were repeatedly frozen, and both classes of working women were left out. This contrasted dramatically to the LCC provision for working men, for whom 3 monumental lodging houses were built between 1892 and 1906. I'm sure some of these will be familiar to you. The most architecturally impressive is this one, Carrington House in Deptford, designed in 1903 by the skillful in-house architectural team at the LCC. This 6-storey house displayed this rather elegant stripped arts and crafts styling and distinctive end pavilions, which are out of view, and this powerful entrance range. It also accommodated some amazing interior spaces for 800 men. And the plan included this large smoking room, a well-lit reading room that we see here with 3 fireplaces. It's very much an institution of self-improvement, and this was clearly an important space with that amazing lantern above. A number of other services were provided, such as a feet washing room, a boot brushing room, a tailor's and a bootmaker's shop. So the London County Council was clearly encouraging men into work and helping them to remain or to become presentable for employment. All this done through the power of architecture. The men's lodging houses that I describe here. There's 3 that were LCC, and then there's the Roughton houses, which I don't think I've included this night tonight, but you're probably familiar with the Roughton houses. There are about 6 or 7 of those built in London, extraordinary scale. The one in Camden Town from 1905 had 1,000 men, like absolutely whopping, very distinctive buildings. So they were mostly, all of those lodging houses, the LCC ones and the Roughton houses, were very much for labouring men, mostly, not exclusively. The census is really revealing on that, but mostly. But I show you here a rare hostel for professional working men, before we go on to the women's story here. These are described as bachelor clerks, that was what they were called. They're probably similar to what Peter mentioned at the beginning, the kinds of men, perhaps slightly lower waged, but the kinds of men who would have lived in bachelor chambers, like what you described earlier. But this was very much a hostel, but for bachelor clerks. It's in Stockwell, as Ingram House, and it was heralded as the first building, quote, for the purpose of providing residential clubs for clerks and young men in business. Designed by Arthur T. Bolton in a very distinctive cross plan, it was set up like an Edwardian country house with an arts and crafts details like black Belgian marble steps, wrought iron lanterns made by the Birmingham Guild of Handicraft, and a pair of salt-glazed ware ovals representing youth and age from the nearby Dalton Company potteries, Dalton and Company potteries. It was for 200 men, and it was larger than any of the women's hostels that were there at this date. It also was all bedrooms, not a cubicle in sight. You can see the fairly substantial partitions there. It's hard without a comparison, but they're definitely bedrooms, not cubicles. So serving the kinds of clerks and secretaries and civil servants that I'll turn to shortly, mostly from the women's perspective. But bear this in mind when we get to those. Each clerk's bedroom here had proper furniture, including a clerk-like fitted desk with stationery and inkwells. There were hundreds of slipper baths, very unusual showers, a kind of peculiar contraption with described as a restorative needle-fine spray, which was patented but didn't seem to have caught on. There was a large gymnasium, a photography dark room, a billiard room, and outside on the grounds there was a 5s court and a miniature rifle range. So it was very much set up like a kind of country house, as I said, or a country club, but more like the men's lodging houses from the LCC. It also had 200 lockers in the basement, so it was not as grand as it seemed, but the optics of this sort of country house atmosphere were very much designed into the building, intended for male lower-waged clerks. By a twist of fate, a decade after this was opened, the architectural delights of this hostel for male clerks were made available to women. It had faced an uncertain future as the clerks were enlisted in the First World War, and it was saved. It was a big campaign in country life to save the building, and it was repurposed as, quote, a club for educated women workers. A contemporary newspaper around this time sort of heralded this transformation, but asked what would happen to the large smoking room furnished with men's big chairs. It went on to answer its question that the male friends of the members, and perhaps the members themselves, of course, may smoke, seemingly surprising itself with this realization. And we do not know, of course, if any of the women members played 5s or billiards, or indeed used the rifle range. But yeah, amazing building, that one. And it sort of shifts us into the next section, really, which is really focusing on that very specific type of hostel, large-scale hostel, but for working women, and this brand new building type that emerges after 1900. It was really radically quite a new concept. It took the model of those ladies' chambers that we'd seen at the beginning, Sloane Gardens House and York Street Chambers, but were less grand, and took the model of the vast men's lodging houses, but smaller, to build a new building type, these hostels for the women who flooded London after 1900 to work. As had been the case with the residential chambers for middle-class women in the 1880s and 1890s that we saw, many of these new hostels favoured limited dividend companies for their business-like rather than overtly charitable approach to help them be founded. These companies, they did employ emotive language, and the opportunity to save women from peril was certainly a sort of argument of their capital campaigns, but they were very much sensible investment opportunities, not philanthropy, and those hostels that achieved self-sufficiency with a 4% return for investors were much lauded. One of the first was Brabazon House, which we return to here. It's on the Vauxhall Bridge Road in Pimlico. It opened in 1902 under the patronage of the Brabazon House Company Limited and was designed by Robert Stephen Ayling, a name we'll hear a few times today. The Brabazon House Company was the philanthropic endeavour of Lady Brabazon, the Countess of Meath, and her company appealed for investors by promising a suitable return on capital, but also, quote, great satisfaction in the knowledge that thereby help is given to a number of gentlewomen working in London in difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions. It was women activists, entrepreneurs, and aristocrats who campaigned for this urban housing revolution, established businesses, and gave their blessing of respectability to further their cause. As you can see here, Ayling concentrated the detail of Brabazon House very much on the facade, with its canted bay windows and those shaped gables and the jaunty little kind of OG roofs on those oriels. But behind this, if you look on this side elevation, is really quite utilitarian, very densely backed rooms and cubicles, given a window each, but very quite institutional and straightforward there. And you can sense the high densityness by the placement of the windows. Brabazon House had ample shared social rooms, including interconnected 2 ground floor sitting rooms, one of which you see here with fireplaces and cornices and large windows. The women balanced their busy working days and their tiny, small private spaces upstairs with time together in the comfortable shared dining room and sitting rooms. Here they could read newspaper in the wicker chairs, play the upright piano, or sew, write and paint at tables, as well as enjoy each other's company. This sitting room provision was essentially inflating the middle-class home to suit a community of 90 women in this case. The residents also ate together and no doubt conversed on issues of the day in this communal basement dining room. The dining rooms were nearly always in the basement. This was well lit by the area around it, into those windows, and there were fireplaces and that little colonnade and these lovely coloured tiled dado. And you can just see on the left, I won't be able to read it, as, in what is otherwise a perfectly staged photograph of the tables perfectly set for dinner, that the impressive superintendent, Jeanette Lindsay, had clearly left a little note tacked up there, which is tantalisingly not quite legible, which is really annoying. I've tried so hard, but you can see that please is underlined. So obviously something annoying was happening regularly in the dining room. But there we go, a lovely communal space. And this is one of the bedrooms. There are precious insights into the way that the first Brabazon House residents, or indeed any of these first residents, kept their belongings in their sleeping quarters. But I've been really lucky to find a few interior photographs. These show that the residents included home comforts and family pictures that reflected their own identities in their tiny bedrooms. They also made efficient use of this limited space by incorporating storage trunks that doubled as seating, putting fabric coverings on the standard issue furniture, and displaying photographs and figurines on shallow wall shelves. And that back left there is actually a makeshift wardrobe as well, that curtain hung below that shelf. This was photographed again by Bedford Lemire, and it was lit, this room was lit by an overhead electric light, and that 6-pane sash window dressed with plain curtains. Lovely little insight, and there are a few others published in women's journals and magazines at the time, but this is by far the clearest. Sadly, we don't know who she was. So while living independent lives, the residents of these hostels had the company of a superintendent or a manageress, she was often called, living on site. Here at Brabazon House, it was Jeanette Lindsay who made a noteworthy career shaping the role and designed a series of hostels. She went on from one to another by the same company and clearly influenced their design going forward, making improvements. She lived in a well-placed room here from where she could oversee the affairs of the house and perhaps provide some reassurance to investors, residents, and perhaps their families. This was her own sitting room. And like the other communal rooms in the house, there were framed pictures and elegant furniture, the epitome of a middle-class domestic setup there for Miss Lindsay, as she was called. There's a lovely obituary when she died in the 1940s, just saying how she'd really helped to shape this accommodation. So the architect, R.S. Ayling, had been articled an assistant to Charles Barry. and was a medalist of the Royal Academy. He specialised, as his obituary tells us, in the unlikely pairing of public abattoirs and housing for, quote, better class working girls. So there we go. He was a real, one of the real sort of architectural heroes of this story. He was a card-carrying member of the National Association of Women's Lodging Houses, which campaigned for municipal housing for women. And here are his beautifully annotated building control plans for Brabazon House at London Archives. They show us the distinction between bedrooms and cubicles. These are cubicles, these are private bedrooms, slightly larger, similar width partition shown here. And the manager's suite, this little here, and elegant sitting rooms on the second floor, which gave both sort of prospect out of the building and also privacy for the manager. In the basement, Ayling pioneered an exciting new amenity. It's the first time we see it here, accessed by a handy bicycle slope. Yeah, so here's the bicycle slope, and there's the bicycle room. Down from the pavement. So there had been external stores in the late 19th century for bicycles at some of these women's hostels, but this bringing actually into the building with its own formalised space helped to formalise the new custom of women cycling and associated it with their independent living in London. It also fulfilled one of the hopes of the castle in the air we heard about earlier, when the activist Emily Hobhouse specified that bicycles, parentheses, her parentheses, and a place to clean them, dash, the suggestion of an architect, close parentheses, would not be forgotten. So there she was, clearly thinking, working with designers and architects to think about how to create places for bicycles, in this case, in women's residences. Emily Hobhouse lived in one of these as well. She's great. Ayling went on to design the company's, Brabazon House Company's second project, which was Hopkinson House across the Vauxhall Bridge Road, 1905, to house 120 women in cubicles and bedrooms again. He heralded it as a residence for ladies in the Building News Journal. This is the sanitary plans, you can see. He improved on the plan by enlarging the main sitting rooms, adding 2 further sitting rooms on the first floor. On the upper floors were cubicles and bedrooms, a nurse's room and sick rooms for sudden or infectious illness, as they described it, which must have been a really grave concern in this very high density housing. All modern conveniences were provided. Each floor had 3 baths, lavatories and a water closet, electricity throughout, and the bedrooms were fitted with metered gas fires which could boil a kettle. The basements, this is the ground floor plan. You can sort of see the manageress's bedroom, a number of other bedrooms, and that very long sort of tripartite sitting room there on the left. In the basement was the dining room, servants' bedrooms, and a bicycle store again, and a small photographic room with an interchangeable clear glass and ruby light window, and a clear and ruby electric light. And the census tells us that Ethel Nix was living there in 1911, a photographic artist, so she must not have been able to believe her luck when there was a built-in photographic room in her hostel. During this period, the homes for working girls, which I mentioned earlier, mostly designing sort of working class housing for working class young women, shifted its focus to serve the same class of business girls as the other emerging hostel companies. And in 1905, it opened this purpose-built lodging house in Marylebone with the Edwardian Baroque kind of hallmark design with its coins and plait bands, these exaggerated key blocks, and these gentle canted bays over the entrance. A rare glimpse of joyful abandon is shown in this remarkable scene of hostel residents demonstrating the canvas fire escape chutes. They unfurled from the top floor, and there's open sash windows, where several residents were waiting, perhaps in anticipation of their turn coming up. As one exhilarated resident, you can just see her face where the fireman standing had just safely reached the bottom of her chute. The fire brigade assisted the practice session while the boy over here, you can just see his face, delivering goods from the London home delicacies of Bond Street, stopped his bicycle and looked on in astonishment. This is now a hotel. By the end of the 19th century, there were 25 YWCAs in London, and the first purpose-built one was this one, Ames House and Restaurant from 1904. We're in Fitzrovia now. It's designed by Beresford Pite, very important architect who you'll know. He designed this very stylish corner building, which I haven't shown you a photograph of, which I realise is quite mean. It's gorgeous. Very sort of arts and crafts mannerist combination. It's really lovely diaper work. But he really helped to define the plan of the new building type, which is why I focused on that here. This building housed 97 women in cubicles and bedrooms. And again, you can see that distinction, the slightly thicker partitions and the thinner ones, distinguishing those spaces. It featured a small shared sitting room, a large public room at first floor, a residence dining room at the first floor. And an office for tending to fees and other matters. A contemporary description tells us that every little cubicle and bedroom has its own window and electric light. There's a washroom and a workroom containing provision for heating irons for the use of the boarders. The drawing room is kept for reading and music. It's a lovely little insight there. If you look now at on the left, the ground floor plan was given over to 4 shops, which helped fund the enterprise. They're still there. The well-known sort of Italian cafe, that back one there on Mortimer Street, as well as the Welbeck restaurant, which was distinct from the residents' first floor private dining room for women who weren't residents. And the YWCA had opened its first restaurant in 1884, and restaurants for working women flourished in this period, really providing a safe space for women to come and eat on their own or with other women in a way that we obviously take for granted today, but there was a sense that would have not been appropriate otherwise in this period. This hostel and restaurant combination was a very thoughtful, business-like pairing, which was unique to the YWCA. This is now the Adolescenti Gallery. I talked a little bit about municipal housing earlier, but just to focus very briefly on the sort of national picture, most British cities and towns were having these conversations and were thinking about how to fulfil their duty for municipal housing for women in ways that London never did. Glasgow built its first women's lodging house in 1872 with rooms for 125, and Cardiff provided a women's hostel from 1911. England's municipal exemplar, however, was this one here in Manchester, which opened Ashton House, the first purpose-built model lodging house for women on modern lines, opened in 1910. It housed 222 women with beds in a series of dormitories and cubicles. So really amazing, fairly institutional, but also well-articulated sort of arts and crafts building with that subtle castellation on that sort of apsidal end. And again, very unusually, the use of lettering to describe what it was, women's lodging house. As you see on the return elevation, those paired, very plain windows hinted at its function, and the name, having lodging house in the title, suggested a fairly sort of institutional use. But this was clearly a building of design, of quality in its design and its materials, and Manchester was clearly proud of its civic duty. It's rightly listed as being the pioneering example. So municipal funding, as we said, was a long saga over several decades in London, but it finally kind of came to the fore, not with municipal funding, but with private philanthropy, but in this building. And this essentially created the women's lodging house that had been long sought. The money came from Ada Lewis, a wealthy Jewish philanthropist who had shared her peers' concerns about lack of decent housing for single low-waged women. It opened in 1913, and the National Association of Women's Lodging Houses, who had kind of seen it through to completion after her death when she left a huge amount of money, finally achieved the building they had sought for a decade. It was opened by her, Princess Louise, and marked a significant shift in the provision for housing low-waged working women, providing for twice as many women at half the cost as what had been available. The first time anything that was anything like the scale of the men's LCC lodging houses. It was designed by, this is on the New Kent Road, just down from Elephant and Castle, so I'm sure known to a number of you. It's designed by Joseph and Smitham, an imposing Queen Anne revival sort of country house again that referred to sort of historicist sources with its stone dressings, modillion cornices, those rusticated coins, and the pedimented main entrance reached by those grand kind of semicircular steps. The seemingly generous upper floor windows on the facade belied the tiny paired cubicles behind. So it's basically a cubicle partition in line with the join of the casement windows there. But this historicist style certainly conferred a sense of authority that fitted the semi-institutional use of the building. Yet also this lovely rich detailing produced a proud building to suit the women it housed. It was also made with the pioneering fireproof technique of Mouchel Hennebique ferroconcrete, I'm sure many of you know, and it was visually apparent in the beams and stairway partitions. You can just see those beams in this interior view here. But to soften all this robustness, the many communal rooms were lined with coloured glazed tiles, incorporating swags and pilasters and arched niche and decorative tile fireplaces. The country house theme kind of continued inside. The sitting room housed chairs for ladies reading the newspaper, as you can see posed over there in reclining cane chairs. Sheet music waiting sort of just there on the piano, and Windsor chairs drawn back from a table with these potted aspidistras which just appear everywhere, and blotting paper primed and ready. So a very sort of genteel effect of the interior fit out. But this is what it was like upstairs. So 4 floors of sleeping accommodation in U-plan corridors, with bathrooms at the end of the wings, and just what seemed like an endless parade of cubicles. There were 214 single cubicles and a few larger, bigger rooms, special rooms, but a tiny number. They were constructed with a gap at the bottom and a metal grille at the top to further air circulation. But within the first year of its opening, after 1913, the trustees realised that those 6 or so special bedrooms, which were a bit more expensive, were constantly let. But perhaps not surprisingly, the cubicles less so. And the very low-waged girls and women that the hostel had hoped to attract were not using Ada Lewis House. They commented, the trustees, that the hostel was, quote, not being patronised by the poorest women so much as by those in rather more comfortable circumstances. Teachers, typists, telephone clerks and nurses there were plenty, but singularly few of the workers who chiefly need cheap as well as respectable accommodation. So it wasn't long before the issue of those gaps in the partitions was raised by residents, and only some months after opening, the trustees commissioned the original architects to fill those gaps in the partitions. So again, it was sort of designing out the poorer women, but making it more practical, at least for a new community. Ada Lewis House. So this is the image of one of the typical bedrooms on the right, and it was very much modelled on the men's Rowton houses on the left. Ada Lewis had inherited an eye-watering fortune from her husband, Samuel Lewis. You probably know some of his model dwellings, really important housing in London. And she demonstrated a commitment to housing working women in her will from 1906. And she said specifically, housing for London's women's lodging houses on the principle of the Rowton lodging house. So she very much saw that this was going to fulfil that particular need. And you can see how clearly they are modelled. On the left is a typical Rowton house bedroom, and on the right is Ada Lewis, even all the way down to those sort of branded bedspreads there. I'd love to find one on eBay one day, but not yet, alas. So during the First World War, the housing needs for women greatly increased, moved to urban areas in great numbers, of course, to engage with the war effort. And the National Association of Women's Lodging Houses commented in 1915 that, quote, the strain of the war has rendered their hostels abundantly useful. Amazingly, opened in 1916, during the war, was this remarkable hostel, Nutford House, near Paddington, citing, quote, the increasing number of occupations now being thrown open to educated women, such as schoolmistresses, students, secretaries, shorthand typists, and manageresses of small businesses. So they were still very much focused on those particular women's needs, even during the war. The architect was Victor Wilkins, who exhibited this design. This is his Royal Academy drawing from 1915. And it's an impressive building, and particularly noteworthy given the time it was opened. I just show you here a plan because it accommodated 100 women in bedrooms, not cubicles, this one. It was a matron, a large social room, and this is the basement plan showing the large dining room, which was below it. But you might not be surprised by now. What I wanted to particularly point out was this is the pavement. So underneath the pavement in these vaults are cycle stalls. So 14 individual vaults, 7 by 10 feet wide. So I calculate it's probably enough for each of the 100 residents to have stored a bicycle there. So extraordinary. Other hostels, as we saw, had included space for bicycles, but the imaginative use at such a scale was really striking. This will be well known, of course, to Peter and others who are familiar with the NLA's home. But company housing for women is a whole nother story. In fact, it's a whole chapter in the book, but I just wanted to touch on it briefly. Nurses' homes, of course, are a very familiar building type, but also hostels for women working in department stores that flourished in the same period. This was built for Bourne and Hollingsworth, just around the corner, their big shop department store on Oxford Street. Residents were, the shop workers were not obliged to live here, but most did. And this was the first hostel from 1907, there at the bottom of South Crescent on Store Street. Had a large dining room and sitting room, also a recreational hall, a bathroom with an astonishing 32 bathtubs, a ballroom with a gramophone, which was rather lovely, and 2 grand pianos, and a library, and inkwells and blotting paper. So a really lovely affair. A few years later, they realised that wasn't big enough to house all the Bourne and Hollingsworth shop assistants, all women, drapers and hosiery fitters and all those sorts of roles, the census tells us. So they built a larger hostel in 1912, just along Gower Street, and this had the previously unheard of facility of a top-lit swimming pool, complete with a diving board and slide. How exciting is that? So a really exuberant use of space and exercise for the enjoyment of the female residents and employees of Bourne and Hollingsworth. There was also a ballroom and a stage, a men's cloakroom, as it was annotated on the plan, and a waiting room for callers with some rather austere wooden benches up against the wall. So yeah, sounds like they had an active social life. Development after the war, nearing the end now, moved into the expanding suburbs, not surprisingly, here exuberantly with this amazing scheme, Lady Workers Homes Limited in Highgate of 1925. This featured 765 flats with bed-sitting rooms and shared bathrooms in this playful kind of interwar Tudor style. It's the epitome of a kind of suburban retreat from the city where many of the women who lived here were working as clerks. There was slightly more space here for individual women. They had a sort of bed-sitting room arrangement and use of kitchens and things. But interestingly, later worker homes also used this new model of investment where the residents could, so think about it as a business-minded enterprise, but adding in the idea that the women could buy shares in the company, thereby furthering their own economic prowess as well as supporting their own community. Also suburban, although slightly earlier, but right nearby is in Hampstead Garden suburb is the magnificent Waterlow Court, designed by Bailey Scott, the improved industrial dwellings company, at the request of Henrietta Barnett, built in 1907, a really sophisticated courtyard development, fully kind of infused with the arts and crafts spirit, and attention to detail from every element of the building, quite sort of cloistered arrangement, as you can see here. The women residents had much more space here out in Hampstead Garden Suburb, 3 to 5 room flats throughout, so considerably more space, but the census shows us that the women had almost exactly the same roles as the other hostels I've showed you so far. So they're working as teachers, clerks, kind of insurance agents and the like. So very similar, but leafy and architecturally just remarkable, that one. It's not just a London story or even an England story, and there's a whole chapter on kind of the international picture. We have hostels in New York at the same time. There's interesting sort of differences in their design, but the same concept. This is the first hotel for women in New York, the Women's Hotel, later called the Martha Washington Hotel from 1903, designed by an English ecclesiastical architect, actually, Robert W. Gibson. This was initiated by the Women's Hotel Company, founded in 1897, with support from wealthy, often female subscribers who owned much of the stock. So that's a really lovely example. And again, most of the residents were teachers, bookkeepers, stenographers, and a contemporary account indicated that a particularly large number of literary women, including one young woman who's just brought out a book. So in 1907, actually, the Institute of Women's Suffrage Council was based in the building as well. And there's obviously a really interesting story, which I talk a bit about in the book, about the kind of the suffrage movement, which was inevitably being discussed and encouraged by these amazing hostels. And the YWCA, again, a story in themselves, but worth commenting, particularly those designed by the remarkable architect Julia Morgan, who specialised in women's YWCAs. And this one, there was the first. What I just wanted to focus on for a second is about the ones that were built called Phyllis Wheatley branches. So essentially for African American women as a sort of counterpart to the traditional sort of first YWCAs, which were exclusively for white women. And this is a remarkable photograph from Richmond, Virginia. This is one of the Phyllis Wheatley branch hostels. It's not a purpose-built building. They adapted an 18th century house, but it became the Phyllis Wheatley branch for African American women in Richmond in Virginia. This amazing hostel there. So there's a whole story to tell there. And likewise in Paris, the Société Philanthropique provided women with a large lodging house. This one from 1906, the Hôtel Meuble pour Dames et Jeunes Filles, furnished hotel for women and young girls. This 6-story building had 24 tiny bedrooms, or chambrettes, which I guess is French for hostel, which is a lovely word. And they have very thin partitions. I don't think I included an image. There were offices and bedrooms for the superintendent, really similarly to the London ones we've seen, and this large communal grand salon that you see here, and a library with a fireplace. These dignified and well-dressed women in the grand salon give an air of grandeur that, as in London, contradicted the really basic, again, not full height partition, sleeping accommodation that was upstairs in this French housing as well. Just coming to close now. So many of the purpose-built chambers that we've seen, the lodging houses and the hostels that accommodated London's working Victorian and Edwardian women, they still survive. Of these, most are used as residences, but with a more diverse range of occupants these days, of course, and new uses too. There are private flats, an art gallery, a smart residential club, elegant hotels, a backpackers hostel, charitable refuges, NHS accommodation, and a private secondary school, and housing for university students. So all those different uses are in the buildings I've shown you tonight, and many more besides. As we increasingly tell a broader range of stories in our places, the importance of these buildings in housing the first generations of working women is a narrative to learn from and celebrate. Fewer than 10 of the 170 or so that I cover in the book have been listed for various reasons, and a couple, very sadly, have been demolished. We can honour the generations of working women who campaigned for these lodgings and thrived in them by understanding and retaining the architectural and historic significance of the buildings that house them so well. In time of great challenges for affordable housing in London and other cities, as Peter alluded to at the beginning, this model of the investment-led hostel for single working women and men is a compelling one, albeit with larger rooms today, of course. A few women-only schemes with small bedrooms and communal kitchens and social areas have been approved and rejected in recent years, and the COVID pandemic showed us the importance of communality and well-being, as well as the stresses of isolation. Perhaps some imaginative thinking about housing models that could suit the 21st single working person, perhaps with communal working space added to the plan, might prove valuable. And there was a lovely article I saw on Instagram in the Times last weekend about that amazing set of lodgings for older women in Barnet. Women's hostels, houses and chambers gave them an architectural foothold and a presence in the city as they went about their work, their business and their lives. In this period of great change, Edwardian London took on new sounds of tapping typewriters, ringing bicycle bells, and the swish of long skirts as women navigated an urban landscape where they felt newly at home. We can imagine scenes of businesswomen, like these ones, arriving with their suitcases and travelling to and from work in the neighbourhoods where these clusters of chambers and hostels took root, ensuring that their very presence was shifting the opportunities for their peers and for generations to follow. Women now took their place in cities through their new forms of labour, with courage, ambition, and by necessity, in offices, exchanges, workshops, and stores. They were bolstered by these new residences, exclusively for them, which brought relative comfort, camaraderie, and respite at the end of the working day. Tiny private spaces, with a metal bed and a jug and a basin where they could unlace their boots, were set against larger, cheerful, communal rooms where they could write, eat, sew, make music, and converse together. These provided space for each resident, with few resources of her own, but with gumption and companionship in spades, to find her way, supported by fellow female residents and staff in this self-sustaining architectural model. Thank you.
Because I thought it was really interesting seeing Bourne and Hollingsworth staff having their own housing. And of course, nurses had homes as well next to hospitals.
Absolutely.
And we seem to have given up on all that. And is that a sort of answer for some of our housing issues at the moment, that companies could well provide places for their less well-off employees and invest them, I would have thought.
Yeah.
So that was a statement, I guess, rather than a question.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
But that whole lesson of similarity between some of the sort of services provided and build to rent today, I think was very clear for social environment and all that sort of thing.
First, again, a statement first of all, I was amazed how many single women were working before the First World War, because I mistakenly thought, oh, it was the First World War that changed everything, but they'd already come in their droves from the sound of it.
Yes.
But did you get in under the skin of sort of how they operated? I mean, was it all hunky-dory and everybody got on? Or was there a bit of, tension or naughtiness or whatever else, and people who wouldn't leave and people who were noisy and difficult and awkward?
Fascinating. I mean, I wish there was more on that. So there's very few kind of accounts or diaries, which I kept hoping to find. There's a lot of novels at the time, so I poured through many Edwardian novels looking for any reference to housing, and found quite a few. Evelyn Sharp, for example, lived in some of the housing on Store Street, actually the precursor to the building that we saw. And so she wrote about her experiences, and then some of her characters lived in one of those sort of fictitious residences. So there was talking about kind of annoying sniffles heard through the thin partitions. There were definitely rules and curfews. So there was kind of, most of the hostels said you couldn't come in after 11 o'clock unless you could sort of demonstrate a genuine work need for doing so. But there weren't a lot. I didn't see anyone kind of being sanctioned in any way. There aren't many company accounts either. The Ladies Associated Dwellings company accounts are in Westminster Archives. That was the most sort of illustrative of kind of the rules. I think leaving bicycles in the dining room was one of the big concerns, which led to the formalisation of the space. So I think there obviously real friendships forged, and there's some lovely things of some people coming to the wedding of their woman they'd lived with in the hostel sort of 40 years later and stuff, at funeral and things. So it's nice.
But I also liked how, was it Bourne and Hollingsworth, how they decided to have a swimming pool for their staff, because they obviously wanted them to get on well, and I'm sure that that camaraderie would have, if people have fun, they probably work together much more efficiently, and I used to work for a German advertising agency, Springer und Jacobi in Hamburg, which was really big, and they used to joke that to the owner that we were like a sect, because they had holiday homes both in Sylt on the North Sea and in I think in Malta.
Wow.
So it was encouraged, and they would always go sailing on weekends, and they'd go on holiday together. And they sort of joked that we were like a sect, but it was very deliberate, because if people sort of got on, then you work together better as a team and you're more efficient as well.
Yeah, it was definitely, there's a lot in that, I'm sure. There's also a slightly sort of weird kind of patriarchal thing about the Bourne and Hollingsworth. I mean, the directors lived on the top floor.
It's like at Norman Foster's, where the partners sit by the window overlooking the Thames, and then the lower grades there's a hierarchy there.
I think there was a hand over there.
Well, one of the questions was actually yours, just about the sources that survive of people who had lived there. But I did have another question, which was particularly at the end, you showed the one from Richmond, Virginia, specifically for African Americans. And was there any kind of race consciousness here in the UK? Just they were completely mixed.
Yeah, it's a great question, and really all I have to go on is census records. There was definitely a sort of international dynamic, and there were some hostels that had sort of clusters of Swedish people, for example, some who were born in India, but all in the kind of sort of white colonial families. So it was I didn't find anyone of colour living in these particular hostels, and again that's just what I had access to. But I think that's probably fairly representative. There were definitely hostels in sort of slightly there was a Salvation Army in Whitechapel, a very famous one for women, and I expect that would have been more diverse and representative of people living in, in the East End at that time. But yeah, no, really not at all here, but obviously a very strong sort of segregation story in the US hostels. So I hope, perhaps to find a bit more on that, but yeah, alas, yeah.
Presumably a lot of the occupants would have been coming into London, the ones who had sniffles were homesick for the countryside or somewhere where they'd come into. London was obviously growing at the time,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
there'd be a lot of people coming from the rest of
Definitely,
the
yeah.
UK.
A lot of sort of, it was very interesting to see where people were born. That's the only way we can figure it out, of course. But yeah, a lot of sort of home counties, a lot in London, who lived in London, who were living there, but some from further parts, but not too far.
Right,
Tend to mostly be in the sort of easy reach of London, kind of home counties.
And once you were a tenant, could you stay forever? Or
Yeah, they varied, and some were sort of some were sort of short term. Some would stay for a couple of years and then went off and got married. That seemed to be a kind of recurring narrative. But there are definitely some older women who I presume had lived there for a long time. Certainly women in their 60s, 70s. I think I even saw a woman in her 80s who was living in the hostels in the Sloane Gardens house for sure. So, and then you could just see the age, and it says of private means for occupation. And there were some that I knew had been there for a long time, and I think just hadn't left rather than sort of coming in later in life. So that was quite an interesting story.
Rooms without windows, and then later they had windows. The cubicles didn't have windows. Were there standards that different architects were looking at different examples? Was there an exchange of information where they studied which were more popular?
I think just inferred is rather than into a big discussion about it. I mean, there was the fact that they all had windows. I think there was that sometimes they would be sharing a window, but I don't think there were any that were sort of windowless. And then there was Ailing, of course, was a great champion, and he was publishing his designs in the Building News, like this one, for example, and a little bit to the plan. So, and the National Association of Women's Lodging House, they had quite a lot of meetings where they would talk about the kinds of things that were required, but there wasn't a set of standards that I've seen anyway that were kind of being formally followed. But a lot of discussion of measurements of spaces, the cubicles versus the bedrooms.
There was a couple of questions. One is about the escape chutes. These canvas escape chutes. And also, I just wondering about if they had concierge as well.
Yeah, so that's the only thing I know about is they're just fire escapes basically, and I think they must have had them. They were just practicing in case of fire. But it's the only reference I saw to that. A lot of them had emergency stairs at the end of the corridors, and no, nothing like a concierge. They weren't sort of hotel-like at all. The only there was staff, mostly housemaids, a few housemaids, usually teenage young women, and a cook normally, and then this sort of manageress figure or superintendent who was always in resident, but no other. It wasn't sort of a lobby as such, just a kind of hallway. And she would keep the accounts, I think, of who was coming and going.
I've got two questions, if that's okay. If you rented there, what happened for eating? Did you have to pay extra if you were eating?
Yes.
Yeah. And that varied. And did you have a choice?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, there's some interesting discussions of kind of very Victorian sounding menu options. Yeah. You could have breakfast, and you could it was sort of a la carte, I think, was the sense.
Okay.
You could sort of pay for whatever you could afford.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And the other question was, how long did they go on for? I'm particularly interested by the Sloane one, knowing the club that it is now.
Oh,
Yes,
lovely.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I probably need to do a bit more on that. They tend to be, I do see some being built in the 1930s and 40s that are sort of modernist, it's almost the same floor plan, but sort of stripped modern. In West London, there are quite a lot. Still Ada Lewis House lodgings being built in the 30s, but nothing post-war, and a lot of these go out of use after the Second World War for women. They either become men and women or just entirely different uses. But it's an interesting story. But the number of people who I've talked to, and they sort of say, actually, I either lived in one or my great aunt did. And I think it'd be really nice to sort of gather some of those sort of post-war stories. So I think I might send a questionnaire out soon.
Yeah.
Holly Lodge was converted only about 10 years ago.
Yes, yeah. Yes, you're right. There are some special ones that have kind of carried on in that very distinctive use. You're absolutely right, yeah. And there's, yes, and there's another one, Herne Hill, I think, what was it called? I've forgotten the name of it, but there's a really interesting little sort of gallery development in Herne Hill, which is, I think that still was women's housing until relatively recently, but sort of in, I guess in the sort of statutes rather than it being a kind of official.
That was a great talk, Emily, thanks so much. It packed an awful lot of info into that, and it's a great story. I'm so pleased to see that quite a lot of these buildings physically still
Yes,
survive.
yes, that's what's wonderful.
And I hope Historic England go to list some more on the strength of your book here.
Might put a few in.
I hope so. Yeah, you must. We've been struggling with Driscoll House down on the Orchid Road where they want to turn it into a hotel, and we've been, as local conservationists, fighting that because they want to build a big building in front of it. I think one of the things I think fascinating about revisiting this now, and Peter alluded to this, is what we're witnessing down in Southwark are lots of planning applications for what's called co-living, which is a similar kind of scenario where everyone has tiny rooms and they kind of have shared spaces. And I initially thought, well, this is just another ruse for developers to make more money on these sites, but now I can kind of see actually there's a need for this sort of density. And so it's interesting that that building type's being revived again quite energetically.
Claire?
Well, except that co-living is enormously expensive, so I think it is a ruse to make as much money as possible. It's a totally different, I mean, it would be really interesting to understand what the rent was here compared to what the alternatives were for the various women. But I guess the problem was you could rent for not very much, but it would be in a really sleazy, sort of dangerous area with sort of horrible conditions. So this was but I was comparing it to co-living mentally all the way through your talk and thinking, yeah, but there's something slightly more exploitative, I think, about co-living now is the problem. And yeah, I'm sort of wondering what today's version of this is.
Yeah.
Well, there's
Go
a women's pioneer housing in Acton, which is new,
Yeah.
which for refugee women.
Yeah.
But in terms of kind of working women or middle class women, there isn't a model.
Key worker housing.
Contemporary
Yeah.
model.
Or even if it was people, not women, it's
Yeah.
kind of, I suppose it's sort of that intermediate housing, isn't it? But even that is just spectacularly expensive.
Yes.
But maybe that's just London.
Yeah, so like kind of key worker, being nearby and not necessarily big, particularly if someone's out working late or kind of at an early career stage when you're perhaps not home very much anyway. It's that sort of that kind of need feels like it's missing.
You're absolutely right. Co-living is crazy, but also you never get buildings of this elegant scale. These are ground plus 4, 5, 6 maximum, and you show no buildings bigger than that. They have a glorious scale. Whereas co-living, the reason why it strikes one as being just about greed is always about height or about density. So we'll look at that form of housing is actually vertical living, tiny little cells, some token communal spaces, but nothing like the.
Probably more than token, but London land values are insane now. That's what creates the hype. It's not. It's part greed, but it's part just that business model right there does not work anymore. Cannot work. So.
Well, that might lead into it, because you were saying nurses' homes, obviously the one at St Mark's Hospital has been closed for a few years now. I mean, was it just that nurses in that case didn't want to live there anymore, they'd rather have their own places, or whether it was a model that didn't work financially and so the hospital felt they had to close it, I don't know. But it's
What is it now? What is it now?
Oh, it's been made into, it's all that new
it's all,
housing
yes,
now,
it's
isn't
all the
it?
helical bar,
Yeah.
Right.
I think, yeah. So, people have a different expectation of living quarters, I suppose.
Yes, but I came out of the Marston Hospital not long ago and there was a nurse leaving, and she was cycling, but it was a wet and miserable night. And I said, "Where are you going to?" And she said, "I'm cycling to Kilburn." And then as she cycled off, a Porsche went down into the basement car park of the building opposite, which up until about 2000 was a nurses' home where they could just walk over the road and go to bed, which as I thought that was a sign of the times, really.
Yeah.
Right. No more. Well, oh yeah, yes, no.
Well, maybe today it could be houses in multiple occupation, which is, using something which wasn't built for that, but trying to subdivide until you get small bedrooms, and then you keep the kitchen where it is and it's shared by 8-10 people.
Yeah.
It was clearly not built for that purpose, but now the only way to maybe, keep the terrace houses going is renting them out to 6-8 people.
And presumably there wasn't a sort of London plan in those days where it was all seen as a part of the whole economic growth of London as a strategic provision. They were provided because there was seen to be a demand for them.
Companies and activists, who are responding to a demand, absolutely, yeah. Can I just mention this? I forgot.
Oh yeah, no, yes,
I
of
talked quite
course.
a lot about bicycles and the empowerment that they brought to Edwardian women, but I've just brought some leaflets of a charity that I'm involved with, which is World Bicycle Relief, who provide bicycles for men and women and children, but to enable their lives to be much better by increasing mobility and reducing distance. So anyway, if you're interested, there's a little QR code, you can get their newsletter and find out about but it's sort of the modern day equivalent, I think, of empowering bicycles for mobility and better lives. So thank you.
Jolly good. And the other sales pitches is.
I've got a few books, but that's fine.
Jolly good. Well,
Thanks.
Emily, thank you very much. That was
Thanks, Peter.
wonderful, and thank you all for coming.